Alright, hello and welcome finally to the Khora review video. I'm glad I waited to do this, as Khora was made a bit better, and if I would have had to review her prior to this, not only would that video currently be irrelevant, but also I'd have to hand out a D rank. Luckily, Khora is no longer a D rank. She has made some strides in being better, but she might not really quite be where she probably needs to be yet. So let's talk about Khora. First and foremost, Khora's abilities. Khora has Whip Claw. This is a Whip Crack that hits an area. Whip Claw scales off melee mods and has combinations with your Strangledome and your Ensnare abilities that we're going to talk about when we get to them. In general, I found Whip Claw to not really do enough damage to be worth building into. I built a stat stick that is purely for using Whip Claw, and ended up just being really disappointed that I didn't just have a regular melee weapon. So the damage output on this is, let's call it, not stellar, even if you specifically build for it, unlike something like Atlas, where building for Atlas's 1 is very effective. With that, I actually found going not in on Whip Claw at all actually also makes it easier to use for combo purposes, like with Ensnare. So Ensnare is a CC ability. This is essentially going to be Inaros' 4. You put it on an enemy, and then it slowly drags in more enemies to continue stunning. The combo with this ability is if you use Whip Claw on Ensnare, it pulls in all enemies in a radius and bunches them all up and stuns them all. That can be useful for clearing enemies with either AoE weapons or like your regular normal-ass melee weapon in general, and is pretty good. Unfortunately, this combo is disrupted a bit by one of your other abilities, which we'll get to in a moment. We have Venari. So Venari is now entirely passive. Venari is always active. You cannot get rid of Venari except by letting them die, and even then there's a timer for them to come back, or you can just tap 3 and Venari will show back up regardless. Venari is a Kavat that is lacking a real special ability. So if you tap 3, you have modes that you can switch between. You have attack mode, which is the one where Venari attacks and does her like special jump all over the enemy thing. I found that trying to get Venari to do damage reliably and stuff is kind of a fool's errand, so I don't use this mode. This is the Protect mode. So in Protect mode, Venari will go after enemies and attempt to disarm them and also knock them down. This mode I found to be really, really slow and also not very effective for keeping Khora alive. And then finally, we have Healing mode, which is the mode that I've actually been using. So this is a pretty self-explanatory. Venari goes around healing you and your teammates. It's pretty good. It can also heal sentinels and stuff, so that will help keep your sentinels alive in longer missions if you decide to take Khora to them. Along with that, each form has a marking functionality. You can mark yourself in the healing form, which will force Venari to put the heal on you if you're damaged, and you can see the little icon barely floating above my head there, in order for Venari to buff me, like that. With the attack and protect forms, you mark an enemy so that they can either attack the enemy or try and steal their weapon and knock them down. But basically, healing form is the only really worthwhile thing. One of the nice things about Venari is that if you're going to use 2 cats for some reason, you don't like have to make 2 bite and maul mods, for example. And I know here on the left, this 86% crit chance with 6.4 crit multiplier and 344 base damage, I know that might look like halfway decent. In practice, it's really not, because Kavats are not very smart. So, with that, like I said, no special abilities. You can't use the ability of the Smita or Adarza Kavat, so you're not going to get those consistent crits, and you're not going to get like double resources or any of that business. You can use things like Swipe, Pounce, and Sharpen Claws. Sharpen Claws is occasionally useful because Khora, turns out, hates armor like every other Warframe in the game. But, again, Sharpen Claws tends to be not consistent enough for you to really rely on it in situations where you would need it. And things like Sharpen Claws and Swipe don't appear to proc whenever you command Venari to attack a target, which makes commanding her to attack a target like twice as bad as just letting her act on her own, because if she's just acting on her own, maybe she'll at least use Sharpen Claws on a target. Besides that, Hunter Recovery is here so that when Venari does attack, you get healed, so that's kind of useful. Otherwise, like, this is pretty basic. I have not put any Forma into Venari or Khora because it is not worth doing. Like, I understand what this Warframe does, and being able to put further Forma into them is not going to be better, let's say. Like, Venari, like, what I could put on Venari is, like, more tankiness, but Venari can just be resummoned immediately if they die, so I don't really feel the need to do any of that. And, like, they could have Metapet Kit to give themselves even more healing. Again, they're functionally invulnerable as long as you know how to hit 3, so not really needed. Sense Danger, also not exactly high value. Forming Venari would kind of just be a huge waste of Forma. Anyway, on Khora, because I came to the conclusion that her 1 is not worth building for damage in any way, shape, or form, her 2 and her 4 are crowd control. And I know we haven't gotten to her 4 yet, but we'll get there. Her 2 and her 4 are crowd control, meaning that you want to build for a lot of range, you want to build for a decent amount of duration, and because you kind of want to cast a lot, you want to build for efficiency. I dunked strength entirely because, again, her 1, the damage output is just not worth building for one way or another. Again, like, with that, like, I have Vitality on here to help me live through some stuff. That's also why Arcane Guardian is here, because Khora is not particularly tanky. These two things help out with that pretty significantly to give me more armor in some cases and such. Arcane Energize is here for obvious reasons, because it's good on every single Warframe. And besides that, weapons-wise, I have a Tigris Prime, because there's no real reason to not. If you are one of the people that is going to be using the Hunter mods, then this will put Slash on enemies, but rather than having your companion take out an enemy you're putting Slash on, which I know is the gimmick of the Hunter set and this thing that people seem to think is going to be useful, the Tigris Prime will actually just kill your enemy before your pet has a chance to even get to them, which is usually the more effective method. Aside from that, because Ensnare bunches up enemies, the Pox tends to be good. Pox, also good for stripping armor off enemies. I know this hasn't gotten a proper why would you use. Rest assured, it will. I know I've talked about it quite a bit lately. Besides that, because Khora's doesn't really need to be built for a stat stick for her 1, because her 1's not good enough for that to be a thing, I instead decided to give her an Exalted Wit, an Atarax, so that she has that at her disposal. So with that, let's talk about her 4. So her 4 is this big Jungle Gym AoE. This is an area of effect that will pull in enemies and damage them slightly, and it also makes enemies shoot enemies that have been caught inside of it. It is a decent distraction tool, but a lot of times it's going to make it kind of more inconvenient to kill enemies, and also, with that, it doesn't keep enemies on, like, the ground floor for you to easily mop them up, which means that you can't use your 2 while every enemy is, like, pulled to the center of this, let's say, and then use your 1 on them to, like, affect everyone within Snare and do any, like, cool stuff that way. It ends up just being kind of annoying, but it is a good panic CC that is akin to Vauban's 3, although in practice probably a little less useful besides the enemies being distracted bit. So with that, this does work. This does work, but it's not particularly great. And this is the 150 test that we have been doing. So one of the cool things is using your 2 and then your 1 in combination to pull all these enemies in. That's cool. Sets them up to be like Atarax real good. That's pretty neat. You can use your 4 to distract enemies and pull enemies in. Use your 2 at longer ranges. And like if there were enemies around this bombard, you could pull them in there. I'm going to get rid of all his armor. And there we go. But like it turns out that what's really happening here, like the majority of the work is kind of just being done by your weapons. Like there's not really a huge point to like Khora's damage stuff. Like her 4 is supposed to do damage and all that, but in general you're kind of just letting your weapons take care of the business for you while you crowd control enemies and like they get distracted by your cat and further things like that. And, like, it works. It is functional. But it's not really good. Like, there's not really any big thing here. Like, the crowd control is done better and more conveniently for your easy dispatch of your enemies by a number of other Warframes, and Venari just doesn't really offer any kind of, like, team support outside of a small heal that could be done way better by any of the other support frames, and you get other things along with them in general. Like, for example, even on Oberon, he has pretty decent scaling damage, which Khora does not. And that's all Oberon really has, besides his pretty good healing and armor bonuses to the team. But yeah, like, Khora is not unusable. Whenever she released, I would probably have told you that just never play her. She's playable now. It's just not... Like, I wouldn't advise someone to use this Warframe. She's very firmly in the C rank for me, because there's kind of nothing special here, and I would pick most Warframes over her. But she exists. Her abilities do function. If you are going to go down the route where you use her 1 to try and do DPS, it is worth mentioning that if you hit 4 and get a bunch of enemies in it, and then use your 1 on them, then it will put 50% of that damage to all enemies who get caught in this jungle gym. So that's a thing. But again, it's just not particularly effective. So yeah, if you want a cat, that's the draw. Like, I'm gonna be real straight up with you. The draw is that this Warframe has a cat. If you want to have a cat and also a sentinel at the same time, or even 2 cats, you can do that. That is a thing this Warframe can provide to you. And that's Khora. So I know it's been a long time coming, and I wanted to be more impressed with the Warframe. Like, being honest, I really wanted to like her more, but there's just not a whole lot going on here. So I will see you guys tomorrow. Hopefully she gets better again.